And now, to introduce tonight's speakers. Eli Saslow is an author and a staff writer for The Washington Post, where he travels the country to write in-depth stories about the impact of major national issues on individual lives. He won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in explanatory reporting for a series of stories about the rise of food stamps and hunger in the United States, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing in 2013, 2016, and 2017. Saslow is also the author of 10 Letters, the stories Americans tell their president, which examined President Obama's daily habit of reading 10 random letters from Americans. Simone Alicea is a reporter and fill-in host at KNKX, where she produces stories on business, labor, and other local issues, as well as a fill-in host, co-host, and producer of their podcast, Forgotten Prison. Saslow's book, Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Eli Saslow and Simone Alicea.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. So, Eli, I kind of just want to get right into things.
Sure.
Let's go for it.
I'm ready.
So, the book Rising Out of Hatred is about the story of Derrick Black. Who is Derrick Black?
Yeah. So, well, first, thank you all for coming. It's no small thing to give your night to coming here to think about the rise of the white supremacist ideology. Unfortunately, I guess these days there's also no place to escape that. So I really appreciate all of you coming and investing yourself in hearing and having this conversation, which I think is super important in this moment. So Derrick Black was sort of the young heir to the white supremacist movement. He grew up indoctrinated with these ideas in the household that I would say was sort of the international headquarters of the white nationalist movement, as they call themselves. Derrick's father was a man named Don Black, who led the KKK for 10 years in the United States. Then, once he got frustrated with that, decided he was going to try to overthrow an island called Dominica to turn it into a white utopia. Fortunately, he was caught by the FBI, went to prison. In prison, he learned early internet coding and came out of prison and built the Stormfront website, which for 20 years has been the largest racist website in the world. That was Derrick's father. His godfather is David Duke, I think probably the most notorious racist politician of modern times, with some competition lately, unfortunately. But those two men pulled Derrick out of the public schools in Florida, and they homeschooled him. And Derrick spent his childhood going to these white nationalist conferences through the South and learning these ideas. And then because Derrick was really smart, because he was really ambitious, he began to invest himself in these ideas in disastrous ways and left a massive legacy of spreading this really hateful ideology.
What do you mean by invest? How was he investing himself into these ideas? What was he doing?
So, I mean, in many ways, I think Derrick was indoctrinated. It would have been very difficult for him to grow up in this household surrounded only by these people and not have really racist ideas. One of the problems is that Derrick, as he was hearing these things, began to try to figure out how he could further them. He decided he wanted to have his own impact in this movement. So when he was 10 years old, he began to learn internet coding, and he built 2 websites at the same time. One was a very typical Derrick Black children's page. He shared like photos of superheroes and pictures of his niece. And also at the same time, he built a white pride website for kids that was visited nearly 1 million times in the first year it was on the internet. Derrick would go to these conferences in the South and would become sometimes a speaker on the stage and would share these ideas. He thought his big sort of innovation in this movement, which I think is very present right now around us, is that Derrick told his father, he told these other white supremacists, that the way ahead for their ideology was to scrub their language of slurs, to scrub the websites of Nazi insignia, and instead to try to use sort of more subtle racist talking points that unfortunately have real power across wide swaths of white America, and to try to grow their movement that way. So Derrick, as a test case for this, decided to run for office in Florida, where he grew up. When he was 19 years old, ran for a seat on the Republican commission in his town, a fairly diverse town, and would go around to people and say things like, isn't it too bad that we have so many signs in Spanish now? Shouldn't this really just be an English-only country? Don't you think that there's more crime in the inner city because of the kind of people that live in the inner city? He would spread these false racist talking points without announcing himself as a racist. And in that way, he got elected with 62% of the vote. And white supremacists from David Duke and frankly across Europe began to hold this up as their example of one of the ways that they could begin to infiltrate the mainstream. The night after President Obama was elected, these white supremacists had their big conference in Memphis. Frighteningly, these conferences happen in rooms just like this one. It was in a hotel ballroom in downtown Memphis, and Derrick was the keynote speaker that night, and he told everybody in that room, the way ahead for our movement at this point is through politics. What we need to do is we need to create explicitly a white people's party, and we need to push our ideas that way instead of through violence or outright slurs or things like that. And Derrick was really disastrously effective in doing that.
And so he's at the forefront of this extremist white nationalist movement. He's peddling these ideologies at these conferences along with his father and with his godfather. Eventually he gets older and he does 2 years of community college, and there's a decision, should you go to a traditional 4-year school? And eventually he decides on the new college in Florida. And his father actually thought this could be a good thing for the movement, that it would be good for him to go to this liberal college in Florida. Can you explain what happened there?
Sure. Yeah, this book takes place during these 4 years that Derrick is at this college. The new College of Florida it's the honors college in Florida. So it's a public school. It's also fairly selective. It's smart kids. It's about 1,200 students. Derrick went there mostly because he didn't have very much money and he was really smart. His test scores were off the charts. This was the school that he got into. It was the school he could afford, and he decided to go. Also, I think Derrick thought, and certainly his father believed, that Derrick would have more mainstream potential success with a mainstream college degree. So Derrick went off across the state of Florida, sort of leaving the insular white nationalist world where he'd grown up for the first time, and went across the state to Sarasota, Florida, and started going to this college. As soon as Derrick got there, and probably even as he was making the decision to go there, he realized that New College is in many ways like the total ideological opposite, thankfully, of white nationalism. New College is a place that upholds individuality and humanity and fights for that in every possible way. It's a campus where the students are rightfully concerned about mispronouncing people and microaggressions. And into this space stepped the future heir to the white nationalist movement. So Derrick, again, he's pretty smart. He figured out pretty quickly that if these other students knew who he was, his life there was going to be made miserable. So Derrick, for the first time in his life, sort of made a compromise with his ideology and decided he was going to be a normal college student on campus. He would befriend whoever walked by. He would talk to whoever was in his dorm, but he was going to remain the sort of young white supremacist rising superstar in his public life. So he would befriend these kids in the dorm, and then he would walk out to the quad on campus, and he would call into the radio show that he was still doing every single day on the mainstream airways in Florida, a show that he and his father did for 2 hours, and he would rail against the multicultural takeover of the United States and things like that, and began to live this double life.
That decision to compromise and to kind of not tell his classmates and to not be sort of outward about his beliefs is really, really different than the decision his godfather made when his godfather was in college, David Duke made.
Right.
Why do you think that Derrick decided to go in that direction to kind of keep things under wraps?
That's a great question. I think part of it is that we're talking about two very different college environments. New College of Florida in 2012 was a much different place to be an outright racist than LSU, which is where David Duke went in 1960. There was much less. Derrick knew that there was going to be widespread ostracism of him and his ideas in that place. David Duke, meanwhile, in college, realized that he could stand up on the soapbox on the quad and give speeches, which is where he sort of began his rise in this movement. And suddenly he was surrounded on the quad by, yes, a lot of people who disagreed with him and yelled at him, but also several hundred people who supported him. and who began to grow that movement on that campus. Derrick knew, he did not have an audience for his ideas on that campus. Where Derrick did think he had an audience, and where frighteningly he's correct, was in huge other parts of the country. I mean, the stat that stays with me more than any other from my reporting of this book is that polls in the United States consistently show that about 40% of white people in America believe that they experience more prejudice, more discrimination than people of color or Jews. That is crazy. Nothing about the facts of what this country has been or what this country is support that. White people continue to be privileged and empowered by every statistical measure in the United States. But the fact that that many white people believe that, the fact that this false sense of white grievance is so widely held, it gives these racist ideas real power when they're marketed in ways that don't announce themselves as overt racism. So those were the people that Derrick was trying to speak to, and he thought, those people aren't on this campus, they're on the radio, they're on Stormfront, where there are 100,000 people a day on this message board. I will continue to spread my message that way, and I will pretend that I'm a normal person here.
And he does that very effectively for a while, effectively spreading that message. But meanwhile, he's making all these friends at New College. Can you tell us about some of them?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, New College is a pretty diverse place, particularly like a high immigrant population, Hispanic, Peruvian, and Derrick began bumping into these other students, and because he was trying to live the secret life, he also had never believed in his life that it was effective to be outright hateful in interpersonal interactions. So he began having conversations with these people and talking to them, and in that way began in some small sense to respect some of them. There was a Jewish kid who sat next to him in his math class who was really smart and who Derrick began to realize knew more about early religion and these things that Derrick was interested in than Derrick did. He began to hear little bits of stories about these other people's lives and began to form real relationships with him. And I think that deepened sort of his commitment to this double life, because Derrick began to become afraid not only that they would ostracize him if they knew who he was, but he also began to become afraid that he was going to lose some of these relationships that he was starting in some ways to care about.
It seems to me that he probably could have gone on this way for forever, for the rest of his college career, until the moment when he's outed.
Yep.
What is that moment?
Yeah, so Derrick, one of these students in his math class was a senior who was they all have to write a thesis paper at New College, and he was researching his thesis. It was on the primary extremist threats to the United States. The Southern Poverty Law Center keeps that's like a really big anti-racist organization for those who don't know, maybe the biggest nonprofit anti-racist organization in the U.S. They keep a page on their website called Hate Watch. That's a list of profiles and pictures of, say, the 30 main extremist threats to the United States. And as this student at New College was researching for his paper, he was scrolling through the Hate Watch and saw in this list of extremists a picture of the kid who was in his math class. So at that point, as you can imagine, this little campus sort of erupted into a debate that I think all of us in our own ways are having now, which is, what do you do when you're confronted with the worst kinds of hate speech and dehumanizing ideas? How do you respond to that? How do you react to that? Especially in the case of many of these students, when those ideas are not just awful and nauseating, but are personally disenfranchising. And so the students at this college began to have that debate. There's a really big message board at New College too, called the Forum. It's a place where all of the students could sort of talk to one another. One student could send a message and it would go to all of the other students, always with their names attached. And on the forum, these students began to debate, what do we do about Derrick Black? And pretty quickly, there were two camps, two different ideas about what to do. There were students on campus who said, basically, screw this guy. Let's make his life miserable. Let's make him feel, in some ways, the kind of belittlement, the kind of awfulness that he's been making other people feel for most of his life. Let's make him feel vulnerable. And this campaign to ostracize Derrick, I think, was hugely effective and also, I think, really courageous in its own way. These were white allies, also students of color, they didn't necessarily feel comfortable going up to Derrick and starting a conversation with the future heir to the white supremacist movement. And so instead, they found a way to shut down the campus. They closed New College of Florida. For the first time in 40 years, the school did not hold classes for a day. And instead, these students decided they were going to create sort of a forum on campus for students to talk about the ways in which they'd been oppressed. And Derrick, because these students began to flip him off, they would drop classes if he was in them, he began to retreat in some ways from this campus. He moved off campus, and I think for the first time he did feel vulnerable. And also, because these students were college students who he knew were in some way smart, because in some small way they were now part of his in-group, he also wondered, can this many smart people be wrong? And I think that was the first shred of possibility that maybe a transformation might come about. The other thing that happened is that another group of students decided to make the exact opposite choice. They said, instead of confrontation, let's try invitation. Let's invite Derrick over. Let's see if we can begin to build a relationship with him so that maybe we can talk about some of these ideas, or maybe even more effective, we can begin to help him see past his prejudices to the humanity. Maybe if he starts spending time with people like us, he will begin to know that we actually are not worth being afraid of or being hateful toward. So those two sort of campaigns started happening at the same time.
And so eventually, right, the reason we're here today and that you were able to reach out to him is Derrick eventually does disavow the movement. He renounces the movement and he is no longer a white supremacist. But it's a long journey.
Super long, yeah. I mean,
like, what happened?
Well, so I think, the book happened. Basically, that is the story. This is a transformation that took a ton of time. I mean, it took a year and a half of sustained work by both of these groups of students who continued to use civil resistance and others who used discourse. I think sometimes we hope in our own lives and in the issues that we care about that transformations can come about quickly. Our country's history, certainly when it comes to race, does not bear that out. These are like entrenched, difficult issues, and any kind of transformation takes time. And in Derrick's case, it took nearly 2 years. And during much of that time, these students had no idea if they were impacting him. But eventually, both by hearing the stories from these other people that he became friends with, hearing about the ways that their families actually had been prejudiced against, and also as he began to trust them, he began to open up his ears, and he would read the things they sent him when they sent him studies about racism and the way and discrimination and the ways it affects people. And Derrick, because they were his friends, began to open these studies and read them. And he began to interrogate his own ideology until the scaffolding that he'd built began to fall away. The thing that was still there was his family. I mean, Derrick knew that by disavowing this ideology, and more than that, by doing it publicly and then committing himself to fighting back against it, he was in all likelihood never going to talk to his parents or his godfather or anybody from the first 21 years of his life again, and also would probably be in some, would be taking some physical risk. But I think what Derrick decided, not because it was the courageous thing to do, but because it was the only fundamentally decent thing to do, was that he had to invest himself in anti-racism and fight back against it. So he did that in his first step by shortly after graduation from New College, sending a letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center that was a long evisceration of the white nationalist ideology, apologizing for the colossal amounts of damage that he'd caused and committing himself to fighting back against that damage and also against his family as they continued to spread these ideas. And then Derrick changed his name and moved across the country for fear of his own safety, and that's sort of where I later found him and the reporting for the book began.
Well, and the first time you tried to contact him, he didn't want to talk to you.
Right, yeah, I mean, Derrick, so when in my main work, I guess I would say, as a writer for the Washington Post, I write these longer stories about the big things that are happening in the country. So I'd been sent in 2016 to Charleston, South Carolina, to write about a white nationalist terrorist attack that now these are happening, unfortunately, with stunning frequency. This one was at a historically black church in Charleston. Radicalized white nationalist named Dylan Roof had gone into this church and had killed 10 people, innocent people, for no reason other than what he described as his attempt to start a race war. And he had come to these ideas on Stormfront. So as I was writing about Dylann Roof and writing about what had happened there, I went on Stormfront for the first time to see the things that he'd been reading. And coincidentally, the largest thread on that message board, where they were saying these horrifically celebratory things about what Dylann Roof had done, the largest thread on the message board was about Derrick Black, who just at that moment had disavowed this ideology. So that's sort of how I stumbled into this in some ways and began trying to find him. When I eventually did find Derrick, he was living under a different name at a graduate school across the country, and his first reaction was, no, I can't do this. If people know where I am, they'll come find me. And I think also Derrick, naively at that point, was hoping that all these seeds that he'd planted in the ground, that maybe they would stay there. Maybe he could walk away, maybe he could go and have a normal life, and maybe this white supremacist ideology that he'd helped build would sort of stay at its constant hum in America instead of rising in any way. What happened over the next year, as I occasionally stayed in touch with Derrick, is he began to see all these seeds growing all around him. This was in the year of the Black Lives Matter movement and an oppositional White Lives Matter movement. There was anti-refugee rhetoric sweeping across Europe, anti-immigrant rhetoric dominating the presidential election cycle in the United States, and suddenly also a presidential candidate at that point who was retweeting explicitly white nationalist accounts and using many of the same talking points that Derrick had used himself when he was trying to get elected as a 19-year-old in Florida. And so I think as Derrick saw those things happening, he began to feel in some ways, small ways, culpable, and in large ways terrified about the direction the country was going in, and decided to get back in touch with me and wrote me and said, I need to do this.
In the introduction of the book, you say Derrick's story can in some way, and I'm paraphrasing here, could illuminate a path forward, a way ahead, as we think about the scourge of white nationalism and the prevalence of it. To me, Derrick's story seems so unique, and I have to ask, is there really a way forward? Is there something concrete the rest of us can take from this, or is this just kind of a story that makes us feel good? Like, is there something we can really use here?
Great question. It is unique, but the other truth is that Derrick was unique, right? Most of us, fortunately in our lives, are not going to have a chance to try to confront or transform the future heir to the white nationalist movement. Derrick's transformation is remarkable, but he also had much further to go than most people that we need to work to transform. These racist ideas, especially now, are all around us. And frankly, I know for myself that 40% of white people in the country who believe they're discriminated against in some way, some of those people are in my own family. And I think the lesson to me from reporting this book is the first thing to do is to make the choice to do something, to invest yourself. Like the students at that new college campus very easily could have said, this guy's never going to change his mind. Like, why even bother? Like, what are we going to do about it? But instead, they made the universal choice on that campus to do something. And I think the thing for all of us to do is very different depending on who you are to the person you're trying to change. So for me, for the people in my own life who I know have racist ideas, even if they wouldn't acknowledge them as racist, if those are people who might listen to me, who might sit down with me, who might even care about me or trust me, I think that it's my responsibility to begin to have those difficult conversations with them, especially now. If the person sharing those ideas or spreading those racist ideas is somebody that you are legitimately, for good reason, afraid of, or maybe it's just somebody who you feel like it's not my responsibility to invest my energy in building a relationship with this person to change his mind, which I totally understand, then I think you absolutely have not only the right, but you should try in whatever way possible make it clear to that person that what they're saying, what they're doing, the information they're spreading is not okay. And I think that is a lesson that's applicable in this moment to all of us. Unfortunately, these awful white nationalist ideas do not just exist in the fringe corners of the internet. They exist more than they have in recent memory in our public spaces. So we all have the chance to do some confronting.
One of the things I found really interesting about the book is you don't focus all that much on the response of New College, of the response of the institution to Derrick Black. You spend most of your time sort of detailing his classmates and how they're responding to him. Was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, it was in part a conscious choice because there was almost no response from New College. And not just no response to me, there was no response from New College once Derrick Black was unveiled to be who he was. My own suspicion of what happened is that New College admitted Derrick without Googling him. They didn't know that he was the future of the white nationalist movement. And when they found out, first, they were probably mortified. And second, they were terrified of a lawsuit or of doing something that was going to cause an even greater uproar on campus. Derrick was in good academic standing. He'd never threatened anybody on campus. They didn't really have the means to kick him out without it being very legally problematic for them. So what they decided basically was, we'll see if the students can figure this out. And fortunately for them, that worked. I do know that, though, that there are many students at New College who resent that decision, particularly students of color on that campus who felt like, how could you not say something? How could you not make me feel, less afraid? To have the administration be silent in that moment, I think, allowed for some fear to percolate in ways that some of those students are resentful of.
Well, and that's such a debate right now, right, as to what extent, I think as colleges in particular feel this, but I think all institutions, are they required to, when a white nationalist is outed, when a racist is outed, to take some kind of action. And, I guess the thing that occurred to me is that in this case, you did have the students who stepped in, and it was the sort of free speech of students, that marketplace of ideas that eventually solved the problem. But the question is, at what cost?
Well, I'm making an assumption for you, but as both of us as journalists, for me, the First Amendment is foundational and primary, and I think free speech is incredibly important. And I would say that in some of these instances, there are better ways for communities to figure out how to respond to speech than to outright police them. So there's somebody named Richard Spencer who, unfortunately, if you haven't heard of him, I'll tell you about him now. But he rose into Derrick's place in this movement. When Derrick left the white nationalist movement, Derrick's father began to cultivate a mentorship relationship with this guy, Richard Spencer, who is now, he would describe himself as like the, academic, young leader of this white nationalist movement. He is despicable, plainly. But Richard Spencer, as I was reporting this book, announced that he was going to do a college speaking tour. He was going to go to colleges around the country to speak about his ideas. And there were a number of ways that colleges responded. Some of them tried to say, no, you can't speak here, including Auburn University. Richard Spencer filed a lawsuit against them, an injunction, and won. And that was a huge victory for him and something that was covered in the major press in the country and gave him a lot of attention. That was great for him. The other thing that would happen sometimes is he would go to these campuses and he was looking to agitate. So a bunch of other white supremacists would come, Antifa would come, they would video everything, there would be clashes, it would bring him a lot of attention. So this speaking tour went on this way until Richard Spencer decided he was going to go speak at Michigan State University, where I think the students came up with what was a brilliant, organized solution. The students on this campus decided, he can come here, he can speak, we are going to make sure that nobody goes in the auditorium to listen. Nobody goes in. And so Richard Spencer went to Michigan State, walked into the auditorium, there were 6 people in the audience, and that was the last speech that he gave on his college speaking tour. So I think that there are ways for communities to figure out what are the things that they are going to listen to instead of what are the things that people are allowed to say.
In the book, you go very in depth into the ideologies that Derrick and his father believed and how he would peddle them, and you really, really lay it out, kind of what is the modern white nationalist movement, what do they believe, and how are they talking about it. Was there any fear, and has there ever been any fear in your reporting about publicizing those beliefs to a wide audience? Because I know that that's a debate also. To what extent, when you're outing racist or when you're talking about racism, do you want to let everyone know, hey, here's a thing that people believe that you could join too? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Honestly, no. I didn't have that concern, and I don't have that concern, because ignoring or explaining away racism in America, which America has tried very hard to do in the history that we tell ourselves about who we are, that has not worked. That has been the American way, right? To say, or the white American way, to say this country is a great meritocracy, and the American dream is an equal opportunity proposition, and everybody has a fair shot. Those are the myths that we've propagated, and they're not true. They've never been true. The truth is that white nationalism is foundational in what America has been. And so I think in order for us to do the work of confronting this ideology, we have to first understand what it is, and we have to be honest about what we have to do to confront it. If we don't know what the problem is, then we keep allowing ourselves to spread these false stories about who we are, and this ideology continues to grow. What was really complicated for me in this book was writing about Derrick's father, Don Black, because I had to spend a lot of time with a lot of these people and work to earn access to them and go and sit down with Don Black again and again. And those were uncomfortable conversations, not only because he would ask about the Judaism in my own family and those things, but because it was upsetting to hear from him again and again that he felt like they were winning and that these ideas were spreading. And that was really upsetting time. But also, Don Black is a really important character in this book, because Derrick, in the end, what he was going to do, the thing that was holding him to this ideology, was he knew that to break away from it, he was essentially going to be stabbing his father in the heart. And those two had a really close relationship. Don Black is somebody who's done irredeemable things in his life. He's caused huge amounts of fear and damage. He also was a father who really loved his kid and was really proud of his kid, and in some ways was a good parent. And so finding a way to acknowledge both of those truths at the same time, to hold these people to account for what they've done and what they believe and what they continue to do, while also not denying them their basic humanity in the way that they've denied others their basic humanity, was really complicated. And eventually I think I came to the conclusion that if there are some ways in the book that some of these racist demagogues feel more real or more like people, first of all, that's true. These are all people. The scarier truth is that the awful characters in our history are people who love and feel and care in the same ways that we do. So first, it's just the more real thing to do. The other thing is, the biggest problems I think that we have happen when we dehumanize people and not when we, in some ways, humanize them. So, writing about somebody like Don Black in a complicated way was a real challenge.
You mentioned that these racist ideas, are foundational to America and to who we are. What I have found interesting, both in your book and in other research that I've done about white nationalism, is supremacists believe this. This is something that anti-racists have been trying to sort of get people to understand, but this is also something that white nationalists believe in a completely different kind of vein, or to different ends, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I would say that's the fuel of the movement. It's also what makes it so dangerous. Like these white nationalists don't necessarily have a huge share of money, or they don't raise a ton of funds necessarily. What is the fuel that drives them is the feeling that they are fighting for something that is quintessentially American. And the haunting thing about going onto a place like Stormfront is that the people who are quoted as the icons of the movement are people like Thomas Jefferson, and frankly, most other white men in power in the first 100+ years of our country. So, in fact, Derrick has said something to me sometimes that I've found really interesting, which is that he, in some ways, finds it harder now to be like a prominent anti-racist activist, because when he was a white nationalist, he was advocating for things that felt in the stream of what America has been. And being an anti-racist means actually confronting many things that are basically American, including most of our structures, which were founded in white supremacist ideas and continue to empower those ideas in many ways now. So it's anti-racist work has to be really active work. There's an author, maybe some of you know, Derrick actually is partnering with him now at a think tank in Washington, D.C., an anti-racist think tank, an author named Ibram X. Kendi. And if you haven't read any of his work, he's fantastic. But he says something that really resonates with me, which is that there's no such thing as being not a racist. Because in America, racism has been the status quo. So the choice is either to allow those ideas to continue to propagate and to continue to to filter into our space, or to decide to be anti-racist and to decide to do something about it. And I think that's a really smart way to frame it.
You call the book Rising Out of Hatred. And what strikes me in reading it is the care you have treated these characters with, Derrick Black and Don Black, people who, particularly Don and David Duke, who you would might feel revulsion from. And I am curious, particularly for someone like Derrick, who did make all these friends, and he did end up listening kind of to reason and to what was going on. Was it really hatred?
Yeah, such a great question, and a really nuanced thing to talk about. So you mentioned a little earlier that the book explains what white nationalists are, what they believe. And I do think, unfortunately, because it is so around us right now, it is worth kind of explaining that ideology, which I think it's hard to explain that ideology without then thinking of it as hateful. So white nationalists, and this is all false and upsetting to talk about, but this is where we are in the country at this moment. White nationalists believe essentially that white people, as they conceive of white people, are inferior in various ways to people of color. They think, based on the false science of IQ scores that they spread, which is not true, based on all of these other myths and lies, that is what they believe. They think that Jews are not white. They don't consider Jewish people to be white. And in fact, they think that Jewish people in the United States are using their influence in places like Hollywood or in banking or whatever else to propagate a scheme of multiculturalism to bring more people of color into the United States to weaken what these white nationalists conceive of as the great white European race. Again, all patently false. But it means that Derrick grew up believing and espousing ideas that were, that this is the moment when all Jews must leave. No matter what, Jews must go. These were the things that he said on the message board. These are the things that they say on these message boards all the time. And so when you break down what they think, which is that eventually they would like people of different colors to be separated essentially by continent, ideally, that is not only a laughably insane idea, it is also a really violent idea. That is an idea that implies huge amounts of violence and harm and everything else. And I think at the root of that is hate. So while Derrick had found a way to explain these ideas to himself so that he could move through the world by saying that they weren't hateful ideas, the truth is there's so much hate at the root.
Does he describe them that way?
Now he does, yeah. Yeah, I mean, now I think Derrick, and that's part of what's made him effective now, I think, as an activist on the other side, is that he understands these talking points because he created some of them. So, these conspiracy theories that white nationalists rely on now, things like a great replacement or a white genocide, this idea that somehow white people are being intentionally wiped out from the United States. These are ideas that Derrick helped come up with and share on the radio show. So he's very good at breaking down actually where those come from and how by distancing those ideas just enough from the very real history of bloodshed connected to so much of this language, it suddenly flips the talking points in ways that more people will hear them.
So I'm curious, how is Derrick now? What's he up to? What's going on?
He's good. Is he good? I don't know. I mean, he's very devoted to this work. He's changed his entire life and academic career. I mean, Derrick, in ways big and small. Derrick went to college originally to be a medievalist, in part because white nationalists really believe in these, in the mythology and in the iconography of the idea of the great white crusading warrior who conquered the world. Derrick, once he went to college and once he began confronting this ideology, realized that none of that was true, and that in fact, in this period of time that he was studying, first of all, none of these people conceived of themselves as white. That concept didn't exist in the same way. And also, in fact, the part of the world that was rising and was doing better was the Islamic world, and which was the place that many of these Europeans were learning from in terms of how to distill alcohol or read lunar eclipses or all of these other things. So Derrick is a medievalist now, has switched, has worked to learn Arabic, and is now writes and studies the rise of the Islamic world to try to get these medievalists to tell a more global version of of history. He also, is doing a podcast with Ibram X. Kendi, sort of breaking down all of these talking points, these white nationalist talking points for what they are. He's worked with Facebook to try to help them deal with like the rise of polarization and this ideology on their platform. Unfortunately, I would say not super successfully. But he's put everything back into this. But I think he does that in part because he doesn't feel good about himself. And I think Derrick's difficult journey is, I don't know when that moment will come where he does. The truth is that the damage that he caused is real and continues to exist around us. That's why I'm always careful to talk about his story, and Derrick is always really careful to talk about his story, not in any way as a redemption story, but as a transformation story. Many of the things that Derrick did, they can't be redeemed. He doesn't know how many people were marching in Charlottesville because they went to his white pride site for kids. He does know that when these white nationalist terrorists recently have gone into a synagogue in Pittsburgh or a store in El Paso, they have walked out of those massive shooting sprees saying talking points that he himself would say all the time on the radio. And so I think Derrick feels like he has built up a massive debt. I don't know if he thinks he'll ever be able to pay it. It's a complicated question because in some ways I do think Derrick was indoctrinated with ideas that he devoted himself to for the first 21 years of his life. And at some point, I guess my wish for anybody would be that you can go on and live a life that is the life you want to live and feel good about. Derrick isn't there yet. And I think he does a lot of this work in part because he wants to, and also in part because he feels like the only thing to do with the pain and hurt that he feels every time one of these white nationalist terrorist attack happens, the only thing to do is to invest it back in the work on the other side.
So at this point in the program, we still have several minutes, but we're open to questions. We have microphones at either side of the stage. So if you have a question for Eli or for me, I guess.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Mostly for Eli. You are welcome to come up and ask. And we have one right away.
All right, brave. Hi.
My name's Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
I'm wondering, what is the source of the hate that you were just talking about? How does that grow? Where does it originate?
Yeah, what a great and complicated question. I mean, I think the source oftentimes of hate is pain and people who are hurting. I know that these white nationalists, the way that they recruit is that they go into disaffected communities. Right now, unfortunately, there are a lot of young, disaffected, white, mostly men in this country that white nationalists are working hard to recruit. And the reason they're able to seed these ideas is that there are real problems that people are experiencing and real legitimate reasons why they are in pain. I mean, in predominantly white rural parts of America, which is where this movement is thriving, we've seen a historic opioid epidemic, a middle class that in many ways has not recovered from the economic collapse and probably never will. Automation is coming for jobs. Life expectancy for the first time in our history is going down in these places. So people are hurting. And what white nationalists do is they come into these places either online, through message boards, or sometimes in person, and they say, this disillusionment that you're feeling, the hurt that you're feeling, this idea that your life is not turning out the way that you thought you expected it to, that's not because of you. It's not because of your community. It's not because of anything you're doing. It's because of these people that look like this, people that are coming over the border. All of these things are not true. In fact, small towns in the country that have more immigration tend to be the healthier small towns. But that is a very powerful antidote to offer somebody, to say, here's the thing to blame, and also now we're going to empower you with a community of other people who will think like you do, and we will armor you with a sense of community and also ideas and an ideology that you can invest yourself in. I think that's oftentimes where it comes from.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. And then we have one on this
I'm
side.
Carol, and I grew up in France and with the Le Pen family. So I was wondering how much you've looked in the international aspect of that problem and European and what's going on in Europe right now.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Sure. She grew up in France, and I can tell your whole backstory if you want to tell me more. She grew up in France, and she was asking about sort of this movement in that part of the world and in Europe and the international aspects and what's happening there now. They're so hyper connected, and frankly, in part because of Stormfront. I mean, Stormfront, when Don Black built it, he immediately had it translated every day into 5 different languages, French being one of them, and it became a massive international community. So Derrick, in many ways, he learned to speak 4 languages by the time he was 18, in part because he was socialized in these chat rooms on Stormfront where he would talk to people from Europe all the time. And David Duke, his godfather, makes essentially his permanent home in Europe and has found a huge audience there. So they have conferences together. Derrick would go to Europe for conferences. There's a whole move. That essentially is what Derrick identifies as his country. Like these are people who think we share ideas. And I think particularly in terms of anti-refugee action and rhetoric and nationalism and the way that's swept across Europe and the United States is very connected in those hate groups in both places who are working hard to sort of spread that. It's a really internationally coordinated effort. Thank you for asking.
And to the other side.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Jason. So I've got to confess that I've heard a little bit of an interview with you and Derrick through, I think, NPR earlier. Speaking as a white male who statistically has a number of relatives who probably are in the 40% and really wrestles with how to engage dialogue and debate with them, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the strategies that some of the students in college used, those students who landed on the invitation side. I heard just a little bit of what you shared about that and was pretty moved, and I'm just wondering if you could talk about some of those strategies that they used to invite him into dialogue.
Yeah, great question. So could you hear that? Yeah. Okay, great. It was too good for me to repeat. I don't think I'd be able to do it. So the first thing I would say for you thinking about your relatives or your supposed relatives, and something I've thought a lot about for myself. If your relatives are here tonight, this is really helping. This is going to be good. I think part of the way that I have tried to have those conversations sometimes is it's very difficult to talk about race or racism if you start that conversation from a place of accusation. And so I think the truth is, when you indicate that something is racist to somebody, that's you're blaming them for something that shuts it down really fast. The truth, of course, is that all of us in this country grow up with racist ideas. It is impossible to grow up in the United States and not. And that's true for white people. It's true for all people. These racist ideas are structured into us from birth. It's how we see the world. And so I think first acknowledging all of our internal biases and figuring out and saying, not this myth of I don't see color, but in fact, all of us have these racist ideas. All of us live in a world that propagates these racist ideas. How can we go about confronting them? That has helped me kind of start the conversation in a place that doesn't begin with blame. By acknowledging that this is a shared problem. This isn't just your problem. The students on campus, I think, they had really different tactics. One of them, the first students to invite Derrick over to dinner were these 2 Jewish students on campus, Matthew and Moshe. It was a hugely heroic act, I think, because Moshe in particular, his own family history had been defined by the Holocaust. His grandfather and many of his relatives had been imprisoned at Bergen-Belsen. Moshe had gone back to the concentration camps, had gone through the list of prisoners on the roster, had seen all of these people in his family who had died, had really connected to that experience, had learned German because of it. Meanwhile, Derrick had spent much of his young life denying or minimizing the Holocaust. His godfather, David Duke, throws a party every year on Hitler's birthday, and Derrick had learned German to connect to that idea. And suddenly these students would speak to each other, sometimes in the German that they learned because of their divergent family history, at these dinners. And what Moshe and Matthew decided to do very, very purposefully is they decided, at first, we're not going to talk to Derrick about these racist ideas. We are going, our hope at first is that he's going to come back. He'll get to know us. He'll start spending time with us. And instead of saying, hey, we want to talk about these really screwed up things that you're saying. We're going to tell you little by little about our lives. And Matthew would sprinkle in stories about the anti-Semitism that he'd experienced. And these other students who began to come to these dinners, one of them, a Haitian immigrant, would talk about how he'd been stopped and frisked on the streets sometimes in Orlando, which had never happened to Derrick. And they would share their own experiences, and I think over time, hearing about those experiences made it so that it was impossible for Derrick to continue to believe that he was the person at that table who had been prejudiced against or discriminated. So some of it was telling their own stories. And I think then, as the relationships got stronger, once they felt like he cares about us, he's our friend, he might listen to us, then they became much more purposeful in saying, hey, have you seen this study about IQ? We heard you saying these things. And they got much more targeted. But the difficult thing for these students on campus was that they didn't know if they were having an impact. Like there was no like monitor above Derrick's head that said like, now 26% of white nationalists, now 22%. They had no idea. They didn't know where they stood. And sometimes in between these weekly, oftentimes Shabbat dinners on Friday nights, they would go on Stormfront and they would see, oh, Derrick was in Tennessee this week on stage with David Duke, and now here he is back at our table sharing our salmon. And so some of these students, for very good reasons, started to get super frustrated. And they were like, I don't want to spend time with this guy anymore. We're not making any progress. And Matthew said something to these other students that I thought was really powerful. And I've tried to use like philosophically a little bit in my own life, which is he said, you know what, like it is not our job to move the rock. All we can do is push the rock, and we have to keep trying. And what they didn't know was that they were already having a profound impact. It's just that Derrick was not ready to show that yet.
The other thing too that stands out to me about Derrick's story, in addition to these Jewish students and the immigrant students, is also his girlfriend Allison, a white woman.
Yep.
Who is kind of coming at it from a slightly different angle.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, Allison was a huge part of this and was a student who at first was very much in the protest Derrick camp. She was roommates with Matthew and Moshe. So when these two students invited Derrick over to their dorm, she basically said, like, I'm not coming out of my room. I don't want to spend time with this guy. But Derrick kept coming back. Sometimes he would show up for these Shabbat dinners with a bottle of kosher wine. She got really confused. She was like, how is this person who is saying all of these hateful things on the radio acting decently with all of these people every week coming over to our dorm? And Allison, who's now a PhD psychologist and is just intensely curious about people, basically decided, I'm going to figure this kid out. Like, I'm going to start talking to him about what his ideas are and what he actually believes. And so she began building first like a tepid friendship with Derrick that then intensified, where she would have these arguments with him about his ideology. And you're right, that much of what he was saying she recognized as familiar to her from some parts of her family in a white family in rural Ohio. Thanks for asking.
I think we had one more question over here.
Yes, I was curious about the deconversion aspect of this. I myself deconverted from fundamentalist Christianity when I was a teenager, still living at home, and it was a slow process that involved my parents allowing me to read actual history, which is a great mistake. Facts will get you every time.
That's comforting to know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're curious enough.
Right.
So I was wondering if you had noticed in your own research or speaking with Derrick similarities in deconversion stories of people who held fundamentalist or like extreme beliefs that were just false, like were factually untrue.
Yeah, thanks for sharing some of your story, and what a great question. I think sometimes what's really difficult about deconversion, which now Derrick sort of actively tries to do with a group of people, where they go into these spaces on message boards and try to do the de-radicalization work, whereas he was once trying to radicalize people. I think what's really challenging about it is that when you are in sort of a fundamentalist ideology or a tight-knit community, it's not just about the ideas, it's about the people. And you're existing in like a confirming world, and those are your relationships. And that's relationships, I think, are super powerful. That certainly is what held Derrick to his ideology for a really long time. If they had just been ideas, I think the transformation would have happened much more quickly. So I think what I've seen be effective in de-radicalization sometimes is finding a way to provide a sense of community for the people that you're trying to de-radicalize. There's a group called Life After Hate that I think does this fairly effectively, where they sort of not only try to do the de-radicalization work, but they kind of create almost a new community to take care of somebody. And for Derrick, frankly, I think one of the reasons that his de-radicalization was successful was that many of the people who de-radicalized him, once they recognized what he would be giving up, which was essentially everything, they've taken it upon themselves to sort of form a new family and community around him. So Matthew, Moshe, Allison, all of these are the people who are still the closest people to him in his life. So I think that's a big part of it. And a lot of the sort of conversion, de-radicalization narratives that I've read, whether it's Tara Westover's book, or I'm forgetting the woman's name who left that church, the fundamentalist church, where they protest outside of military services. Yeah, the Westboro. Like her story is very similar in that it's, for her it was Twitter, but beginning to form these outside relationships in little ways, and the relationships did some of the work. I think as you probably know better than I do, you're giving up not just ideas and an ideology, but a sense of community, and breaking away takes real courage. Thanks for asking.
So I know there are a lot of questions, but I have time for probably one more. I think we are sticking around, and
we can go for a couple more, maybe.
Yeah. All right.
Sure.
We've got a clock right here.
We have a
so
clock.
We're keeping track.
I'll try to be shorter in my answers. Sorry.
We'll go to this side.
I'm wondering about the University of Michigan, and that in presumably a short period of time, the students managed to keep only 6 students from attending. What were their tactics? How did they work with the rest of the student body to keep them from going?
Great question. So
Do you want to repeat the question real quick?
Sure. How the students at Michigan State were so effective in keeping that auditorium empty when Richard Spencer came. Some of it was through organizing online, through spreading word, through I think the campus newspaper wrote an editorial about it, through getting the word out through big mechanisms, but also it was manpower on campus outside that rally. If they had students stand there not to protest, but for any student who came up, for anybody who was curious, for anybody who was going in, they then in person said, no, we're doing it this way, explain the tactic that way. They had people outside nearby to let them know, we want this auditorium to be empty. So I think it was both the early effort of spreading that idea, and then on that day, giving that message in person again and again to anybody who was going to come. Thanks for asking.
All right, and I think we'll take one last one. You're in.
Thank you. My name is Lonnie Lusardo. First, if anybody in the room has not read the book, do yourself a favor. I could not put it down until I finished it.
Thanks, Lonnie. You should come up on stage. This is great. That's the perfect way to close. No, I'm just kidding.
I do have a question. The distinctions between white nationalists and white supremacists can be argued forever.
Yes.
I've been fascinated all evening with your consistent use of the term white nationalism. Is there a reason why you prefer that term as opposed to white supremacists?
Yeah, thanks for noticing, and really great question. So for me, I think white nationalism and white nationalists is an effective term for a group of people who are actively pushing for greater white supremacy. Talking about them as white supremacists becomes confusing because much of mainstream America remains white supremacist. White nationalists are the group of an active movement politically that is pushing to spread white supremacy, continue to spread the rise of white supremacy in the United States. So I think it's, their ideas are white supremacist. They are pushing for white supremacy, but their group I often refer to as white nationalists because it gets confusing if you're talking about white supremacists because much of our criminal justice system, many of these things remain white supremacist in many ways at the root. So I think white nationalism and white nationalists is an effective way to identify a group of people who actively are pushing to spread white supremacy. Thanks for asking.
And I lied, there's going to be one more, but I'm told it's short.
Great. It can be long.
Or your your subject as being unique, but I've seen a video on YouTube, and I just checked. There is a whole number of different people that are reformed racists on there.
Yes, that's good. I hope so. I mean, the more reformed racists, the better. You know, I think, I guess I hope that at some point YouTube is flooded with thousands of videos of former racists. You know, I think Derrick is unique in that he was so prominent in the movement, but certainly there are many other stories of people who've gone through the transformation. And frankly, I think for our country to get where it needs to go, particularly over these next years, we need many more of those stories, whether people are sharing them on YouTube or not. Thank you. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you. Yeah.
coming out. Thank
Thanks,
you to all
everybody.
of you.
Thanks for coming. Thank you. I think I'll be over there in the corner. If anybody has questions that didn't get answered or wants to chat a little bit, I'll be over there. So thank you all for coming.